I stood in the kitchen, the warm glow of the afternoon sun spilling through the window, illuminating the chaos I had created in preparation for Mark's uncle, Harold. I had been tidying up all morning, dusting the shelves, fluffing the pillows, and making sure everything was perfect. The scent of roasted chicken wafted through the air, mingling with the fresh flowers I had picked from the garden. It was a simple bouquet, just some daisies and wildflowers, but it felt like a gesture of welcome for the man who had been absent from Mark's life for so long. Jess, you know he's just family, right? Mark had teased me earlier, his voice light as he adjusted his tie in the hallway. You don't need to roll out the red carpet for an old man. I chuckled, trying to hide my nervousness. You didn't hear the stories I heard about him growing up. Wild parties, crazy adventures. I just want to make a good impression. Mark smiled, a glint of excitement in his eyes. He'll love it. Just be yourself. As I arranged the last of the flowers, I felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with apprehension. Harold was a stranger to me, but the stories Mark had shared painted a vivid picture of a man who had lived life on the edge. What if he was everything everyone said he was? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Here he is, I called out, wiping my hands on a dish towel as I rushed to the door. The moment I opened it, I was greeted by a tall man with a shock of silver hair and a grin that could light up the darkest room. Harold stood before me, exuding charisma and a sense of adventure that was palpable. Jessica, what a lovely home you have, he exclaimed, pulling me into a warm embrace. I could smell the faint scent of cologne mixed with something musky, and I felt my cheeks flush. Thank you, Harold. It's great to finally meet you, I replied, stepping back to take him in. He looked like he could have been a movie star in his youth, and even now, in his late 60s, there was an undeniable charm about him. Mark, my boy, look at you, Harold bellowed, pulling Mark into a bear hug. I watched as their laughter filled the entryway, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping in. Was I ready for this whirlwind of a man to step into our lives? Dinner was a lively affair. As we sat around the table, Harold regaled us with tales of his travels, stories that danced along the edges of wild escapades and near misses. Mark was enthralled, hanging on every word, and I found myself swept up in the energy. But beneath the laughter, I couldn't shake off that feeling of something lurking under the surface. Jess, you ever thought about traveling? You seem like a woman who could use a little adventure, Harold said suddenly, his gaze piercing through my facade of comfort. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I love it here, really. I have everything I need, I replied, trying to sound enthusiastic, but my voice wavered slightly. Sometimes everything you need isn't enough, he responded softly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. I quickly looked away, focusing on my plate, but my heart raced. Was he flirting with me, or was I reading too much into it? Just then, Mark's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the tension. Excuse me, guys. I'll be right back, he said, rising from the table. I watched him walk away, my stomach twisting with unease. The moment he left, Harold leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You know, Jessica, I can see the spark in you. You have a fire that deserves to be ignited, he said, his breath warm against my ear. My heart raced, caught between shock and intrigue. Harold, that's not appropriate, I stammered, pulling back slightly, but something in his gaze made me linger. Just think about it, he replied, a smirk playing on his lips as he straightened up, the charm slipping back into place as if nothing had happened. I felt flustered, my mind spinning as I tried to regain my composure. When Mark returned, his laughter filled the room again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the evening had shifted in a way I couldn't fully understand. The lines between family and something more had blurred, and I was left with a lingering sense of excitement mingled with dread. What had I just stepped into? As the sun streamed through the kitchen window the next morning, I found myself alone with Harold, the weight of our shared dinner still hanging between us like a thick fog. Mark had left for work, leaving me with the lingering taste of temptation on my lips. I busied myself with breakfast, trying to ignore the flutter in my stomach that Harold's presence ignited. "Good morning, Jessica," Harold said, his voice smooth as honey. He leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my cheeks flush. "How about we explore the town today? I hear there's a lovely little cafe that serves the best pastries." I hesitated, my mind racing with thoughts of loyalty to Mark. Yet, there was an undeniable spark in Harold's proposal, a thrill that beckoned me. "I don't know. Harold, Mark wouldn't like it if I spent the day with you." "Come on," he coaxed, stepping closer. "It's just a friendly outing. I promise to have you back before he gets home. Besides, you deserve a little adventure, don't you?" The way he said it, with that charming smile and twinkle in his eyes, made my resolve waver. I found myself nodding, excitement bubbling up despite my better judgment. "All right, just for a bit," I agreed, feeling a mix of exhilaration and guilt washing over me. As we drove into town, the air was filled with laughter and stories, Harold's animated recounting of his travels making the time fly. I couldn't help but feel drawn to him, his energy infectious. We parked in front of the quaint cafe, its warm, inviting atmosphere promising a delightful escape. Inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods enveloped me as we settled at a small table by the window. Harold reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine, sending a jolt of electricity through me. "You know," he began, a playful glint in his eye, "I can't help but think how much more fun life could be if we let ourselves enjoy it." I felt my pulse quicken as he held my hand, his thumb stroking my palm gently. "This is wrong," I whispered, half-heartedly trying to pull away, but his grip was firm, his gaze unwavering. "Is it really?" he challenged, his voice low and smoky. "Life is too short for regrets, Jessica. Don't you ever want to just feel something?" His words hung in the air, and I found myself lost in the moment, the thrill of his touch sending shivers down my spine. "I shouldn't be here," I murmured, but even as I said it, I didn't pull my hand back. As we shared pastries and coffee, laughter bubbled between us, and for a moment, I let myself forget the weight of my marriage, the loyalty I owed to Mark. Harold's stories painted a picture of a life filled with freedom and excitement, and I found myself wanting to be a part of it. "Tell me something about you that I wouldn't guess," I challenged, hoping to steer the conversation away from the charged atmosphere. He grinned, his eyes sparkling. "Well, I once backpacked through Europe with nothing but a map and a single change of clothes. I ended up stranded in a small town in Italy, but it turned out to be one of the best experiences of my life." I laughed, picturing him as a young adventurer, carefree and bold. "I wish I had that kind of courage," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You do, Jessica," he replied, leaning closer. "You just haven't let it out yet." As we finished our drinks, I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. The thrill of our connection was undeniable, but guilt gnawed at me, reminding me of the vows I had pledged to Mark. On the drive back home, the silence was heavy with unspoken words. I was lost in my thoughts, replaying the moments of laughter and stolen touches, while Harold's presence lingered, near me like a shadow. When we arrived home, I felt a pang of anxiety. The walls of our house felt tighter, as if they were closing in on me, reminding me of the life I was supposed to cherish. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of our home enveloping me, but all I could think about was how easily I had let myself slip into a world of temptation. As I prepared dinner, my hands moved mechanically, but my mind was elsewhere. I found myself daydreaming about Harold, his smile, his laughter, the way he made me feel alive. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thoughts, but they clung to me like a persistent fog. Jessica? Mark's voice broke through my reverie, pulling me back to reality. You okay? I turned to find him watching me, a hint of concern etched on his face. Yeah, just lost in thought, I replied, my heart racing. Mark smiled, but I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Dinner's almost ready? Just about, I said, forcing a smile as I stirred the pot on the stove. But my mind was still adrift, caught between two worlds, and I wondered how long I could keep my feelings hidden. The evening air was thick with unspoken tension as I stood in the kitchen, my heart racing. Mark had just come home, and the sight of him sent a jolt of guilt through me. I glanced at Harold, who was leaning casually against the counter, a glass of whiskey in hand. The way he looked at me, intense, almost hungry, made my stomach flutter, but I quickly shook off the feeling. I knew I had to act normal. Hey, honey, how was your day? Mark asked, his voice warm and inviting. I could see the genuine excitement in his eyes as he stepped into the room, completely unaware of the charged atmosphere surrounding us. It was good, I replied, forcing a smile. Harold and I were just catching up. Mark raised an eyebrow, glancing back and forth between us. You two seem to be getting along well. I'm glad, he said, but there was an undercurrent of unease in his tone. I could sense he felt the tension too, even if he didn't fully understand why. Yeah, it's been fun, Harold chimed in, his voice smooth and confident. Jessica has such an adventurous spirit. She's a breath of fresh air. He flashed me a grin that sent a shiver down my spine. I forced myself to look away, focusing on the dishes in the sink to avoid his penetrating gaze. Right, Mark said, his brow furrowing slightly. Well, dinner is almost ready. Smells great in here, Jess. He moved to help me, but I could feel Harold's eyes on me, and it made my skin prickle. Later that night, after Mark had settled into the living room with a book, I found myself in our bedroom, the weight of the day's events pressing heavily on my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling slightly as I replayed the evening in my mind. I couldn't shake Harold's lingering looks, the way his voice had dipped into something more intimate when he spoke to me. Taking a deep breath, I decided to confront Mark about how I felt. I walked back to the living room and sat next to him. Mark, can we talk? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, his expression shifting from casual interest to concern. Of course, what's on your mind? I hesitated for a moment, gathering my thoughts. It's about Harold. I feel uncomfortable with how he's been acting towards me. Mark frowned, leaning forward. What do you mean? He's just being friendly, Jess. It's been years since they've seen each other. You're reading too much into it. His dismissal stung, but I pressed on. No, it's not just that. The way he looks at me, it feels invasive, like he's trying to get too close too quickly. I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I need you to understand. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. I get it, but he's my uncle. I can't just cut him off because you feel a little uncomfortable. Maybe you're just not used to his personality. He's always been a bit bold. I felt a pang of disappointment at his lack of understanding. I just need you to trust me. I don't want this to become a problem between us. I trust you, Jess. Just give it time. He'll settle in, and things will go back to normal, Mark replied, attempting to reassure me. I nodded, but his words did little to ease the tension in my chest. The night dragged on, and as I lay in bed, sleep eluded me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was teetering on the edge of a precipice, and one wrong step could send me tumbling into a chasm of chaos. Later, I found myself on the porch, the cool night air brushing against my skin, trying to clear my mind. That's when Harold appeared, his silhouette cutting through the darkness like a shadow. He stepped closer, the faint light illuminating his features, and I felt my breath hitch. Can't sleep? He asked, his voice low and inviting. No, just thinking, I replied, my heart pounding. About me? He teased, taking a step closer. My instinct screamed at me to retreat, but I was frozen, caught in his gaze. Harold, I started, but he interrupted me by leaning in, brushing his lips against mine. The kiss was electric, igniting something deep within me that I had tried so hard to suppress. For a moment, I kissed him back, lost in the thrill of the moment, our bodies entwined in a passionate embrace that shook me to my core. But the reality of what I was doing crashed over me like a cold wave, shattering the intoxicating spell. I pushed him away, breathless and terrified. What are we doing? I whispered, my heart racing with panic and confusion, knowing I had crossed a line I could never uncross. I awoke the next morning, sunlight streaming through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. But instead of feeling refreshed, a heavy weight settled on my chest as the memories of last night flooded back. The kiss, the betrayal. My heart raced as guilt washed over me like a cold wave. I had crossed a line, and there was no erasing it. In the kitchen, I tried to drown my shame in the familiar routine of making breakfast. The smell of coffee wafted through the air, mingling with the scent of sizzling bacon. I could hear the faint sound of the newspaper rustling as Mark read at the kitchen table. He seemed oblivious to the turmoil churning inside me. I forced a smile and handed him a plate, my insides twisting with each passing second. Everything okay, Jess? Mark asked, glancing up from the paper. His brow furrowed, and I could see the concern etched on his face. Yeah, just tired, I replied, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. I busied myself with the dishes, avoiding his gaze. I couldn't let him see the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. As the day wore on, I tried my best to act normal, but the tension crackled in the air whenever Harold was around. He had an uncanny ability to find me, slipping into my space with a casual grace that made my heart flutter against my will. Hey, Jess, he called one afternoon, leaning against the doorframe with that infuriatingly charming smile. How about a little stroll in the garden? The flowers are in full bloom, and I could use some company. I hesitated, my mind racing with thoughts of Mark and the promises I had made to myself. But the allure of Harold's adventurous spirit tugged at me, a siren song I found hard to resist. Sure, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. As we stepped outside, the warm breeze brushed against my skin, and I felt a thrill of excitement mixed with guilt. You know, Harold said, his voice low and conspiratorial, I can't help but think you're too good for this quiet little life. You deserve a bit of adventure. I forced a laugh, but my heart raced. Adventure? I have a husband. Remember? I tried to sound lighthearted, but the way he looked at me made me feel exposed, as if he could see right through my facade. Mark is a great guy, Harold said, stepping closer, his gaze intensifying. But sometimes people settle for a life that's too safe. You could have more, Jess. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. What do you mean by more? I asked, half challenging, half intrigued. He took a step back, hands raised in mock surrender. I'm just saying, life is too short to play it safe. You have a spark in you, and it shouldn't be dimmed. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, and I turned away, needing to distance myself from his magnetic pull. Maybe you should focus on reconnecting with Mark instead, I suggested, my voice shaky. Harold chuckled softly, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. Oh, I plan to, but I can't help but admire a woman who knows what she wants. As the days passed, Mark's suspicions grew. He'd catch me staring off into space, lost in thoughts of Harold, and the look in his eyes shifted from love to concern. Jess, you seem different lately. Is everything all right? He asked one evening, his voice laced with worry. Of course. I'm just busy with work, I lied, my heart aching at the thought of hurting him. But the truth was gnawing at me, and I felt like I was caught in a web I had woven myself. I couldn't continue like this. I had to put an end to Harold's advances, but every time I tried, he would charm his way back in, reminding me of the thrill I had been missing. One night, as we settled in to watch a movie, I could feel the tension thickening in the air. Mark sat on one side, his arm around me, while Harold lounged on the other, a playful smirk dancing on his lips. I tried to focus on the screen, but every glance at Harold sent my heart racing, igniting a fire of confusion and desire within me. As the film played on, I could sense the undercurrents swirling between the three of us. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, torn between my love for Mark and the reckless thrill Harold brought into my life. Suddenly, Harold leaned closer, his breath hot against my ear. You know what would make this movie even better? He whispered, and before I could react, he leaned in and kissed me right there in front of Mark. Time seemed to freeze as I pulled away, shock coursing through me. Harold, what are you doing? I gasped, my heart pounding in my chest. Mark's expression shifted in an instant from confusion to fury. What the hell is going on here? He shouted, the tension exploding into the open air. My heart raced as I glanced between the two men, realizing that the fragile peace I had tried to maintain was shattered. The confrontation had begun, and there was no turning back now. The air was thick with tension after the confrontation. I stood in the living room, my heart racing, trying to find the right words to explain. Mark's eyes bore into me, a storm of hurt and confusion swirling within them. I took a deep breath and uttered the only words that felt remotely true. It was just a kiss, Mark. It didn't mean anything. Mark shook his head, his brow furrowed in disbelief. Just a kiss? Jessica, you kissed him. In front of me. His voice rose, the pain evident. How could you do that? I felt my stomach drop as I searched for the right words. I don't know. I was caught off guard. Harold, he has this way about him. It was a moment, Mark. Just a moment. The guilt washed over me again, but I tried to push it aside. I couldn't let him see how much I had enjoyed that moment, how much I craved Harold's attention. Do you have feelings for him? Mark asked, a quiet intensity in his voice that made my heart race. His eyes searched mine, looking for something. An answer, perhaps, or maybe a reassurance that I was still his. No, I exclaimed, perhaps a bit too forcefully. I love you, Mark. You're my husband. Harold is just complicated. He's family, and I thought we could all get along. Mark ran a hand through his hair, visibly frustrated. That's not how it looks, Jess. It feels like he's come in and disrupted everything. I don't even recognize you anymore." The weight of his words hit me hard. I felt like I was losing him, and it terrified me. "I'm still me, Mark. I'm the same woman you married. It's all so unexpected. I never wanted any of this." He opened his mouth to respond, but then paused, his expression shifting to one of contemplation. "I need some time to think." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my heart heavy with regret and fear. As the evening wore on, I tried to find a semblance of normalcy preparing dinner as I usually did. But my mind was racing, tangled in thoughts of Harold and the thrill of our kiss. Just as I was about to lose myself in my thoughts, my phone buzzed on the counter, breaking through the haze. It was a message from Harold, simply reading, "Meet me at the park? I need to see you." My heart raced again, a mix of excitement and dread. What was I doing? I glanced toward the door where Mark had exited, but the longing for adventure was intoxicating. "Jessica, where are you?" I whispered to myself, torn between two worlds. I made my decision, slipping on my jacket and heading toward the door. I told myself it was just a talk, to find closure, to explain that I was committed to Mark. But deep down, I knew I was being pulled by a force I couldn't quite control. When I arrived at the secluded spot in the park, the moonlight painted the trees in soft shadows, creating an intimate atmosphere. There he was, Harold leaning against a tree, a smirk playing on his lips as our eyes met. "Jessica," he said, stepping closer, "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come. Is this a good idea?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper as he drew nearer. My heart pounded in my chest, the thrill of danger making my breath quicken. "I just wanted to talk," he replied, his voice low and inviting. But I could see the hunger in his eyes, and I knew the conversation would lead to more. Before I could respond, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. The simple touch sent shivers down my spine, igniting a spark of excitement I had tried so hard to suppress. "You deserve to feel alive, Jessica. Don't you want that?" Just as I opened my mouth to answer, the sound of footsteps echoed through the quiet park. My heart sank as a figure emerged from the shadows. Mark. He stood there, a mix of disbelief and anger etched across his face, and in that moment, everything changed. Mark's expression was a mixture of betrayal and heartbreak, a look I had never seen on his face before. It was as if the ground had been ripped from beneath us, leaving us suspended in a moment that felt both infinite and excruciatingly brief. He stepped closer, his voice strained with disbelief. "How deep does this go, Jessica? How long has this been happening?" I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. My mind raced, searching for a way to explain, to make him understand that it hadn't been premeditated. It had started innocently enough, but the moment I kissed Harold, everything spiraled out of control. "Mark, please, it's not what you think," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. "I never meant for it to go this far." "Not what I think," he shot back, his eyes narrowing. "You were just about to leave with him, Jessica. What am I supposed to think?" Harold stood there, an uncomfortable silence settling around him. This was supposed to be a family reunion, a time for healing and reconciliation, not this twisted soap opera. "Mark," he said, his tone surprisingly calm, "let's talk about this. There's something you need to hear." I turned to Harold, my heart pounding. What could he possibly say that would make this situation any better? What could you possibly have to say that would help? I snapped. "Jessica, please," Harold said, his gaze earnest. "This is about more than just you two. It's about family." "Family?" Mark scoffed, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're the last person to talk about family. You waltz back into our lives after years and expect us to just accept you? Maybe it's time you knew the truth, Harold said, his voice low. Your mother and we had an affair. It was years ago before you were born. She was never meant to tell you, but it's time you knew the truth about why I've been estranged. I felt the air leave my lungs, the shock of his revelation hitting me like a freight train. What? I gasped, looking between the two men. I could see the color drain from Mark's face. You can't be serious. I am, Harold insisted, his gaze firm. It was a mistake, something that happened in a moment of weakness. We both moved on, but I guess I never really left. I came here in hopes of reconnecting with my family, only to find myself caught up in this. Mark shook his head, disbelief etched across his features. So, you're telling me my whole life has been a lie? That my own mother— Mark, please, I interjected, desperate to bring him back to the present. This isn't just about you and Harold. It's about us. I didn't ask for any of this, but I can't ignore what happened between us. He looked at me, his eyes searching for something, maybe an explanation, maybe a reason to forgive. But in that moment, everything felt impossibly fractured. What do you want, Jessica? Do you still want him? I opened my mouth to respond, but I was interrupted by the piercing buzz of my phone. The sudden noise sliced through the tension, and I fished it out of my pocket, my heart racing. The screen flashed with an unknown number. I know what you did, the message read. I froze, the words echoing in my mind. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, the implications of the message sinking in. Mark's gaze shifted to my phone, and I could see the confusion morphing into anger once more. Who is that? He demanded, stepping closer, his voice rising. I don't know. I stammered, feeling trapped between the two men who had become my everything and my nightmare in a matter of days. It's just a random number. Harold's expression darkened. This could be trouble, Jessica. If someone knows, we can't just ignore it. I felt the weight of their stares, the gravity of the situation pressing down on me. I was caught in a web of secrets and lies, and the threads were unraveling faster than I could comprehend. I need to respond, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Are you kidding me? Mark exploded, his patience snapping. You're going to respond to a threat? This is insane. Mark, listen, I pleaded, my heart racing. I don't know what this means, but I can't just ignore it. I need to find out who it is. Or it could be someone trying to manipulate you further. Harold interjected, urgency creeping into his voice. You need to think carefully. This is bigger than us. I looked between them, my heart pounding, unsure of what to do next. The choice I was about to make could change everything.